Japan, land of the rising sun, and for many game fans, the center of the gaming universe. While many Japanese companies have come to the West and found success, the opposite doesn't usually seem to happen. Stay here for the story of how Atari, under 3 different owners, tried to make it big in Japan and failed. If you grew up in America in the 70s and 80s, the name Atari once stood tall and proud as an innovative company and was likely your first taste of gaming. If you grew up in the 90s or later, Atari may have the image of an also-ran, a company stuck in the past, or, in some cases, buried there. In the 21st century, the name Atari has fallen from grace, to say the least, relying on hits of the past, never able to reclaim its former glory. Though it happened generations ago, there was a time when Atari was king of the hill, and with that, the game market was oriented toward and controlled from America. It might be hard to imagine now, with Nintendo and Sony as modern-day kings, but there was a time when Japan wasn't even a blip on the radar. All the action was made in the USA. It's quite ironic that Atari, an American company, could never catch on in Japan. The company derived its name from the Japanese game Ego, while the famous logo is called Fuji. When Nolan Bushnell founded Atari in 1972, there was nearly no competition in the world of video games. Very few people had ever experienced them. After the success of Pong, Atari was able to take advantage of being, basically, the only game in town, and quickly expanded, founding several international subsidiaries. In August 1973, Japanese-American businessman Kenichi Takumi was appointed president of the new Atari Japan Corporation. In early 1974, Atari Japan entered a partnership with Nakamura Seisakusho Company Limited, aka Namco, to license and distribute Atari arcade games in Japan. Soon after, Takumi would depart Atari, and Hideyuki Nakajima would take over. Atari was expanding, but at the same time was never on stable ground. Founder Nolan Bushnell has stated in interviews how making payroll was always an issue in those early days, and this was also true for its international offices. Not long after these subsidiaries were set up, they were downsized or closed and sold off altogether. Japan was one casualty. Under Bushnell, Atari Inc. completed the sale of Atari Japan Corporation to Nakamura Seisakusho Company Limited for $500,000 US. Debts inherited from Atari would take Nakamura 2 years to pay off, but the deal had also secured an exclusive license to distribute Atari's games in Japan until 1985. The sale also included Atari's Tokyo manufacturing plant, a highly valuable asset. Many games from Namco in the US would bear the Atari name, and Nakamura would follow up by opening game centers in Japan that featured Atari's games. With Namco taking over Atari Japan, it ended the first venture the company had in the future video game capital of the world. In 1976, Nolan Bushnell would sell Atari Inc. to Warner Communications for $28 million. That influx of cash and backing from a major corporation allowed Atari to develop and release the Video Computer System in 1977. The VCS went on to become the flagship product of the company and a symbol of the first generation of home gaming. After the release of several popular arcade games on the VCS, most notably Space Invaders, the home market rapidly took off. Atari was far and away the market leader, controlling 80% of the industry, with a market value of $2 billion. In 1982, the Atari VCS was rebranded the 2600 and was available in over 40 countries. Japan was not on the list, but that would soon change. It had been nearly a decade since Atari ran an operation in Japan and would soon gear up for a second try.
アメリカのチャンネルをストップさせたコンピューターゲームアタリが今日本にやってきた。ブ ラウン管から飛び出すすごいゲームに誰もじっとしてはいられない。ゲームの数が違う、興奮が違う。世界のコンピューターゲーム Atari。
Japan was quickly shaping up as a massive market for games, and Atari was in a strong position to step in and snap up the market quickly before domestic developers had a chance to do so. The 2600, though several years old at this point, was easy to manufacture and had a huge library of games for the time. Home video game systems had already appeared in Japan. Some were simply imported versions of existing hardware, like the Intellivision, sold by Bandai, and others were developed in Japan, like the CassetteVision by Epic. In fact, Epic imported the Atari 2600 to Japan in 1978 in very limited numbers, with little success, only to release the CassetteVision on their own afterwards. Atari Inc., under Warner, established Atari International Nippon in 1983. The Atari 2600 was on its way to Japan, rechristened as the 2800. No internal changes were made to the hardware. The games would play the same, but the case design would be completely revamped into a wedge shape with the game selection switches turning into buttons on the front panel. The power switch was moved to the bottom right, and instead of 2 controller ports, there would be 4. The controllers themselves would combine the joystick and paddle into one, with a button on the console panel to choose which one you'd like to use. The packaging would also be designed specifically for Japan, similar to the silver boxes Atari started using in 1982. On the back of the box, the printing proudly read, "Made in the USA." A massive promotional campaign was launched to create awareness of the Atari 2800. With the westernization of Japan that took place throughout the 20th century, American exports like McDonald's, Levi's, Coca-Cola, and rock and roll were embraced by Japanese culture as something exciting and exotic. Atari followed suit and positioned the 2800 as the next great thing from America. In addition to its own ad campaign, the 2800 received considerable press coverage in Japan. The debut even made the papers back home. On May 10, 1983, the Atari 2800 debuted in Japan at the price of 24,800 yen, a little over $100 at the time. The 2800 debuted with 25 games, which Atari thought would carry the American image well. Among them were Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T., 2 extremely successful Hollywood films that were equally loved in Japan. E.T. was the most profitable film ever, and was also a very expansive game for the time. It made perfect sense to position E.T. as the centerpiece of Atari's American invasion. Games that Japanese players were already familiar with, such as Space Invaders and Galaxian, were part of the set of 25. As the summer of 1983 went on, Atari's prospects started to wane. A long list of problems sealed the fate of the Atari 2800. The main issue would be the aged hardware. The 2800, which is to say really the 2600, was first sold in 1977. Each new machine that came afterwards surpassed the 2600 with better graphics and sound. New home video games that were released in 1983 were already a whole generation ahead. The Family Computer from Nintendo and the SG-1000 from Sega were released in July 1983. The Family Computer quickly took the lead, while Sega followed closely behind. The MSX computer, which also played games, was released that year as well. Nearly a dozen other machines were released or already on the shelves next to the Atari 2800 in 1983. It meant there was only so much shelf space to go around, and the chances of success were smaller each time a new company got in the game. Next would be a misstep in the choice of software. Of course, Space Invaders, Yar's Revenge, Centipede, and Defender were some of the best games on the 2600. But some of the other titles, like Circus Atari, Golf, Air Sea Battle, and Math Grand Prix, were games that should have been replaced with something newer and more engaging. 5 more titles developed by Atari in 1983 were released that September, including Pole Position, which even had its own unique TV commercial. But it wasn't enough to right the ship. On top of that, the Atari 2800 was just too expensive. The debut price was cut from 24,800 yen to 19,800 yen, and later to 14,800 yen to match the price tag of Nintendo, Sega, and all the rest. 24,800 yen equaled about $100 at the time. As a comparison, the Bandai Intellivision cost nearly 50,000 yen. The cassette vision cost 13,500 yen. At the original price, that put the Atari 2800 in the middle. But Japanese companies who made their machines in Japan could benefit from the weak yen at the time, while Atari had to sell at a higher price because that money had to return back home in US dollars. At 14,800 yen, which was about $60 in 1983, the 2800 was selling at a loss. Lastly, there's Atari itself. In Japan, in 1983, you'd have no idea there was trouble behind the scenes in California. The company was losing money. Hardware and software sales slowed as the market matured. As a result, longtime Atari CEO Ray "the Czar" Kassar was terminated in July 1983. If Atari couldn't keep its home office in order, what hope would there be to continue on in an oversaturated foreign market operating at a loss? For all these points, the Atari 2800 simply could not succeed. The 2800 was gone from the shelves by the start of 1984, and Atari International Nippon was shuttered. Due to the Japanese market not being fully established yet and Atari's short stay, sales figures for the Atari 2800 are not even known. In 1984, Warner Communications would sell the home game and computer division of Atari Inc. to Jack Tramiel, often mispronounced as Tramiel. Atari Inc. was then renamed Atari Corporation. In 1985, the arcade division, now called Atari Games, was sold to Namco, who had already absorbed Atari's first Japanese office. Atari Games was bought back by its own employees a year later. A third division, named Atari Tel, that had been developing video phones, was sold to Mitsubishi. The Luma phone, released in 1986, was the finished product from that sale. In the United States, a sea change was taking place. Though the number of releases in 1985 were less than in years prior, Atari hung on to its top spot under new ownership, never ceasing game production. Nintendo and Sega, soon after, released their own game machines in the US, appearing on the store shelves right alongside Atari, just like they had once before back in Japan. And whether or not you believe the story of Rob the Robot being a Trojan horse to save the gaming industry, by 1987, Nintendo had a lock on the American market and controlled it tightly from Japan. Sega took over from Nintendo a few years later. Atari would never be in the driver's seat ever again. In the Western world, some would call this realignment the video game market crash. In Japan, these events were known as Atari Shock.
Atari でポールポジションやるかい？テレビでポールポジションができるのはアタリだけ。アタリ。
By the end of the 1980s, Nintendo was a universal catch-all for video games. With a de facto monopoly in Japan and the US, the 8-bit family computer and NES held 90% of the market. Atari Corporation continued sales of home video games, supporting the decade-old 2600, the newer 7800, and several home computers. The Atari 7800 was not sold in Japan, and was probably a smart move, considering that domestic sales couldn't touch Nintendo. But a new round of machines were coming, as Nintendo, Atari, and later Sega would duke it out in the emerging portable gaming market. In April 1989, the Nintendo Game Boy debuted in Japan and was a huge success right out of the gate. The ability to take games wherever you go and fit them in your pocket was appealing to Japan, where nearly everyone had long commutes on public transportation. Anything that ends the boredom of that long daily slog was welcomed. But Atari had its own portable machine on the way, the Lynx, a machine that, on paper, was a Game Boy killer in every possible way. The Atari Lynx had 16-bit graphics, a full-color backlit screen, and multiplayer networking capabilities. It had power that some home machines didn't have. Atari, under Trammell, felt that this would be the perfect machine to take on Nintendo on its home turf. On November 25, 1989, the Lynx hit the streets of Japan at a price of 29,800 yen, about $200 at the time, and twice the price of the Game Boy. Since 1983, Atari hadn't had a presence in Japan, and no international offices were set up this time around. For the Lynx, Atari arranged distribution through Japanese company Mumin. 4 games, Electro Cop, California Games, Blue Lightning, and Gates of Zendikon would go on sale in 1989. 17 games overall would arrive during the Lynx's stay in Japan. The Japanese gaming media really took to the Lynx and its capabilities. They did a lot of the heavy lifting for Atari in creating awareness of the machine. Atari ran print ads and held live events that would let people experience the Lynx in person. Over the course of 2 years, the Lynx held on against the Game Boy and later the Sega Game Gear and NEC PC Engine GT. The final Lynx game in Japan was Shanghai, released on August 2nd, 1991. After this, Atari stopped promotion and sales of the Lynx in Japan, and the smaller Model 2 Lynx was never released in the region. Surprisingly enough, the Lynx was a success in Japan, at least in relative terms. 500,000 units were sold, despite having very few titles and a short lifespan in Japan. With the Lynx actually making some headway into Japan, Atari tried again with its next machine, the 64-bit Jaguar, which had been hyped in the early 90s by Sam Trammell as the Nintendo killer. Atari once again partnered with Mumin to distribute the Jaguar in Japan, resulting in an exclusive sales agreement with Toys R Us. On December 8, 1994, the Jaguar debuted alongside Alien vs. Predator. Over 20 titles were released in 1995. However, the fate of the Jaguar was sealed before it even had a chance. The Sony PlayStation was released days before, on December 3, 1994. Not long before that, the Sega Saturn also had a successful debut, and another American-developed machine, the 3DO, had been out in Japan for 8 months. Much like the 2800, the Jaguar was fighting an uphill battle in an oversaturated market that honestly didn't even know it was there. By the end of 1995, the Jaguar only sold 3,000 units in Japan. In 1996, Atari sold its assets to a company called JTS, which later passed on through Hasbro and Infogrames. Most consider the Trammells leaving Atari as the end of the lineage of the original company. For all its successes around the world, Japan was one place where Atari tried, and tried again, only to strike out each time. Today, Atari is known in Japan mostly for the term Atari Shock. Those who know their history may know more than that, but for the average young gamer, Atari is nothing more than a t-shirt, if anything at all. In the modern day, the big American company selling game machines in Japan is Microsoft. The Xbox family of hardware has been on sale there since 2002. The Xbox market share has been in the single digits since the beginning, and a majority of stores don't even carry Xbox games. That doesn't mean every American company that set up shop in Japan can't succeed. In 2020, Apple accounted for 52.6% of all smartphone shipments in Japan, a figure that has stood mostly unchanged for over a decade. The number 2 is Sharp, with 12.4%, showing that it is possible for non-Japanese companies to have success in the land of the rising sun, if you can deliver what the customer is looking for. That is, if someone else already hasn't.